Hello class, welcome to week 1 of programming logic with Python. So this week, we're basically just, I'm assuming you guys have little to no knowledge in Python, so I'm going to start at the very beginning, and we're going to kind of like build our knowledge week by week. So this week it's more of an introductory week, so don't worry if you don't really understand anything. I'm going to really start off with the most basic thing and try to slowly build your knowledge from there. So what I have in front of me is the coding packet. You're going to find that on Blackboard. I did mention that during the welcome video. So right now, as you can see, I have Blackboard open. You're going to see a YouTube video, which is going to be this video. You're going to see coding packet 1, which is the packet that you just saw on my screen. And obviously the textbook readings, homework assignments, and chapter quiz. So this video and videos going forward are going to be specific to whatever topics we're learning for that specific week. So this week, I already told you it's an introduction to Python. So let's kind of get into it. I am going to cover most of what's in the packet, and I am going to reference some of the topics from the textbook, just so that you guys have a complete understanding and I'm covering everything. So I'm going to close Blackboard. So I have Visual Studio. That's where I'm going to write most of my code just to explain things to you, to give you like examples as I go along. So let's see. I do think the best place to start is, I actually showed you in the welcome video, it was that hello world print statement that I created. And that's basically the very first thing you're ever going to do when you learn a programming language. You're going to introduce yourself to the environment, in this case Python. And in every programming language, the way you would kind of like tell the console to print something out, the syntax is a little bit different. But with Python, if you want output, output being like if you want your code to return something to you, the user, in a visual way, you would write what we call print statements. So I could show you what a print statement is. I'm going to kind of like document the way I write my code. So like I'm gonna first write a comment, and I'm going to explain comments in a second. But I want to do print statements first. So don't worry about this line. Just worry about this line. Print, and I'm just going to, inside of it, I am going to write hello world. And that itself is a print statement. So you start your print statement with the keyword print, and notice that it's a different color. That's just because it's like a specific keyword. And then inside of it, I do my quotation marks and I write whatever I want to write. In this case, it's hello world. And that would be your first print statement. So if you have Visual Studio downloaded, you could also follow along in my video. We're going to be practicing a lot of different lines of code. So feel free to do that. If you need to pause the video, you do so. So the next print statement I'm going to write is actually a print statement kind of introducing myself. You guys already know who I am, but I'm just going to write it anyways. So I'm going to write print hello. Actually, I'm not going to say hello, because I already said hello. So my name is Professor Gonzalez Tamurano, and I will be your professor for this summer semester. Okay, so now I just created my second print statement. It's just me telling you that, hi, this is my name, this is what I'm gonna do, like I'm gonna be teaching you, I will be a professor for, yeah, I'm gonna be your professor for this semester. It's basically me just telling you what I'm gonna do, and I'm doing it through code. So if I run this, you guys should be able to see, hello world. So when you run the code by pressing that green button at the very top, what is actually going to happen, what you guys see is just a black screen, because that's just the way my software is capturing the image, or my screen. But what you guys are going to see yourselves isn't just like a full screen black image. You're going to see a command prompt window that just opens up by itself. And in the command prompt window, you're going to see this text. So that's that. And this black window, think of this as your console output. So any code that you're writing, um, if you're including print statements, those print statements are going to be outputted here in this console output kind of um, window, I guess. Yeah. So I'm going to close that. So I'm back on my main screen. So that's a print statement at its most basic form. It's just writing text inside of quotation marks, and you put all of that inside of the parentheses of this print. So it's print, open parenthesis, quotation mark, whatever you want to write. Could be however long you want. Close the quotation marks and then close the parentheses, and then you're done with your first print statement, or any print statement. So print statements, I guess that's kind of where I want to start. Um, I know you probably have a question of what this screen line is. Why is it a different color? So let's get to comments. We can get to comments right now. It's not too complicated. So as you guys know, this is a comment. If you guys go to the coding packet, I do have a section on that. So a comment is basically anytime you use the pound or the hashtag pound symbol, whatever you want to call it, um, this symbol right here. The moment you write that in Python, it's going to change the color of your text for that specific line. So it doesn't affect lines after it or before it, it's just for that specific line. So anything I write after it, whether I give a space or I write it directly after the pound symbol, um, it's a comment, and it turns green to like distinguish itself from regular code. So what that basically allows us to do, it allows us to create notes inside of our code, and those notes are never seen by Python. So they're in our code, but Python never executes anything that's green, that's a comment. It's just like ignored basically. So it's just a way of like annotating, like say you write a paper and you hand it into your professor, and your professor like makes notes, like makes corrections throughout the paper, and those corrections don't really have anything to do with the test, but it's just kind of there for reference for you, the student. Same thing with comments, except comments are stuff that's typically written by the programmer themselves, just to like inform other programmers, hey, this block of code or this program, it does this, and on this line it does this specific task, and their reasoning behind doing that, because programmers don't work at a company forever. So like, yeah, they write programs, and everyone writes programs their own specific way. Like going back to that welcome video, I said in programming, it's good to be creative with your code. And creativity is good, but like if everyone is writing their code a different way and including a lot of different stuff to make the code work, sometimes when you're looking at someone else's code that you haven't written yourself, it can be a little bit difficult to understand what's going on there, and that's why comments are so important. So always try to include comments in your code, even if it seems a little bit redundant. It's good practice. So this is what we call a single line comment. If you want to do a multi-line comment, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. Um, Ideally, in Python, they say if you want to do multi-line comments, they just say include multiple pound symbols throughout, where you want the Python to ignore certain lines of code. That works, but there's also another way of doing it. If I wanted to say maybe get rid of these two print statements, not get rid of them, not like delete them, but just like have Python ignore them, I would do the triple quotation mark. So I could do triple here and then triple here. I'm going to give it a space so it looks nicer. So what happens when I do that is the text within those triple quotation marks turn green. So you're going to see later on that triple quotation marks are not just used for commenting multiple lines out of the code, but they could also be used to write strings within your print statement across multiple lines. But just know for now that you could use triple quotation marks if you want to do multi-line comments. If you get that, then great. Don't worry about the other thing. So that is print statements and comments. Hopefully you guys understand up to now. So the next thing I kind of wanted to go over was, let's see, indentation. So indentation is probably the most important thing in Python, next to obviously like understanding different bodies of code that we use in Python. That aside, indentation is in my opinion, the most important thing, because without indentation, you don't really have organized code, and the concept of Python kind of deteriorates, because with other programming languages, we typically have something called a main body, and the main body kind of tells whatever programming language, say C++, that this whole main body is one block of code, really, and it should be executed as such. But in Python, we don't have a main body. We just have a bunch of different lines of code, and we don't. Ideally, we wouldn't have any way of knowing which lines of code belong to which, but that's where indentation comes in. So indentation kind of distinguishes blocks of code from one another inside of Python. So like right here, I have my two print statements. Yeah, they're print statements, but kind of think of themselves as like individual lines of code. So this print statement stands by itself, this print statement stands by itself, and the way I know that is because they're at the same indentation level. So if you see this yellow line, that kind of tells me where I am furthest to the left of my code editor. So if I'm all the way to that yellow line, that means that each line of code is its own thing. Now, when I start indenting, you're going to see. So let me get an example up here. You guys won't understand what this code means, but that's fine. Just pay attention to the indentation. And I'm actually going to, yeah, I'll leave that. So I'm going to do if 5 is greater than 2, and then I put a colon after that, and I press enter. The moment I press enter, notice that my cursor is underneath the 5 now. It did it by itself. So Python recognizes that what I'm creating is a if statement, and in my if statement, which you're going to learn in later weeks, you need to indent when you're after the colon, because that's technically the body of the if statement. So because whatever I'm going to write here belongs to the if statement, it must be indented. So I'm going to write something like print, and this print is our print statement that I introduced at the very beginning of the video. So I'm just going to say 5 is greater than 2. Right? So I'm going to run this code, and you guys are going to see. So first line is hello world, which we already know. The second line is my name is Professor Gonzalez, so it's Morano. And then the third line is that 5 is greater than 2. You don't have to understand why it printed that out, because obviously you guys don't know what if statements are yet. But just know that, actually, yeah, let's do this. You saw that print statement executed, like it worked. It printed it out to the console, black screen, right? So that means it worked. Now, what happens if I move my print statement right here? So the first thing you're going to notice is I have a red line right underneath that print statement, that print line, that wasn't there before. So if I try to run the code, it's probably just going to give me an error. Yeah, it's going to give me what they call an indentation error. I don't know if you guys can see that. Yep. So it's saying that indentation error, it expected an indented block. So it wanted that print statement to be indented to the right, and it's not going to allow me to run the code until I do so. That's just because Python has a certain way of formatting its code that if you try to go outside of the basics, like the format of Python, it's going to give you those error messages. So like I said, you're going to learn what an if statement is in later weeks, but for now, just know that indentation is important, and it could be the difference between writing code that works and writing code that doesn't work. But for right now, we're just writing one-line uh, statements, so you don't really have to worry too much about indentation. But as we go on, when I tell you to indent, indent. So that's that. Let's see what else is on the list. So variables. So variables are the kind of, think of variables as, I like to think of them as like I think most people use Amazon nowadays to order stuff. To, like, say you want to order a new phone, or you want to order um, kitchenware from Amazon. Typically, whatever you order, whether it's kitchenware, whether it's a new phone, whether it's I don't know, a new keyboard or anything, whatever you guys are into, whatever you order from Amazon, um, they usually place it inside of a box, right? And that box gets delivered to your home. Well, think of a variable as that box. So it's that box, it's holding whatever you ordered, and for the most part, I know Amazon does change the design of their boxes, but the boxes are relatively the same. And those boxes can store a bunch of different things. It can store, like I said, a keyboard. It can store kitchenware. It can store a phone. Um, but the box remains a box. It may change sizes, but it's still a box. So, like I said, think of a variable as a box. And let me see if I can get an example. So message equals hello. Okay, so that word message that I wrote right there is what we would call a variable in Python. At its most basic form, notice that it doesn't really have a color. It doesn't change a color when I write it. Like, all these other lines of code all have a specific color to them. So like, if you guys are paying attention, anytime I put anything in quotation marks, it gets this kind of like orangey color to it. Um, that's because in Python those are strings, and strings are just kind of like words or sentences created with words, or even numbers. But they're all, even if it's a number, it's recognized as a string. But we'll get into that in a second. But just know that strings in Python are this orange color. When I use the print word, or the print keyword, it's this kind of like bluish green color, or turquoise. The if statement is a solid aqua blue. And then going back to the variable message, it's just white. That's kind of like the color that they use for variables. You could change all these colors if you go into settings, but by default, that's kind of what they give you for Visual Studio. So going back to the variable, message is my variable, so message is the box. Think of it as the box. And then hello, which is a string, think of that as whatever you're ordering from Amazon. Hello exists inside of the box of message. So whenever I'm referencing message, I'm really just referencing what's inside of it. So if I were to go, like, say, maybe print, because you guys know what print is, and instead of writing a string inside of print, what if I just write message? And if I'm going to do this, I'm going to comment out everything else we did beforehand. Actually, I can't comment out message. Okay. So now if I run this code, you're going to notice that I got the string of hello as my output. Why? Because whenever I'm referencing this box of message, it's going to reference what's inside of it, which is hello. Now, what if I changed this to message equals goodbye, right? And then I print that out. What do you think happens? Well, we're going to see. So I'm going to close this. Okay. I'm going to run my program again. Okay, so now we have hello and we have goodbye. But I thought we printed out message, right? So I'm going to close this again. So give me a second. Okay. So the very first line of code, ignore everything that's green because I removed that, so it's Python's not reading it. So if you look at this very first line of code, message equals hello. Message is our variable. Hello is what we call a value. So anything you're assigning to a variable is a value. And the way we assign a value to a variable is using a single equal sign. This single equal sign means to assign something to a variable. You later on you will see the double equal sign, and that's used for comparison purposes. But the single equal sign is when you want to assign a value to a variable. So we're gonna be using that a lot throughout the course. Like every week, basically, we're gonna be assigning stuff to variables, and then we're gonna be using those variables. Now, I assigned the value of hello to the variable of message, and then I printed out message. And when I printed out message, it gave me hello, as you saw on the black screen. Okay, well, after this line of code, I have the variable of message again. It's the same variable. It's not a different variable because it has the same capitalization or of each letter in the word. It's the same word, so it's the same variable. You could reference the same variable multiple times, but in this case, I assigned it a different value. I assigned it the value of goodbye. Now, what does that really mean? Does that mean that hello no longer is assigned to message, or does it mean that it's printing out both? Is it printing out hello and goodbye? Well, in this case, in this case, it's not doing. It's doing the prior. So it's actually replacing the value of hello with goodbye. So now the value of message is goodbye. It's no longer hello. So then you might be thinking, okay, well, why did it print out both? Well, Python is a programming language that reads from top to bottom. So when I created this initial variable of message and assigned it a value of hello, at that point in time, the value was hello. And then the very next thing that Python does, because it goes from top to bottom, was it was told to print out the value of message. And the value of message is hello at that point in time. Now after that, I'm stating the variable of message again, assigning it a new value of goodbye. So now Python says, okay, well, I already printed out message the first time. So now you're telling me you're changing the value of message? Okay, I could do that. And then after that, it's saying, okay, well, now you want me to print out the value of message. Okay, well, the value of message at this point in time is goodbye. So I'm going to print out goodbye. So Python is always checking what is the value of a variable at that specific point in time, and you can like kind of like manipulate your code to kind of like fit your needs just by ordering things properly. Because you know that Python reads from top to bottom, you know, like, okay, if the value of a variable is this at this point in time, I'll just print it out so that I get that value, and then I'll change it after this. Because if I change, so like, what happens if I move this up here? What do you think is going to happen? Is the value going to be hello, or is it going to be goodbye? If Python's going from top to bottom, So if I run this code, I'm going to get double goodbyes. Why? Because remember, top to bottom. So yeah, the value of message, or let me close this, hold on. The value of message, the variable message was hello, but then I immediately changed it to goodbye. So Python, because it goes from top to bottom, the very last change that it recognized was the value of the variable message is goodbye. So when I'm referencing message right after that line, it's going to go with the latest update, which is message equals goodbye, which is why I printed out goodbye and then printed out goodbye again. Hopefully that makes sense. So that at its very core is message is the variable will always be on the left side, and the value will be on the right side. And then in between the variable and the value is the assignment operator, which is the equal sign. And I just showed you that you could change values and kind of like print out different values depending on where you place things. But yeah, that's pretty much variables. So let's see what else. Numbers. Okay, so numbers is kind of a continuation of what we just kind of went over for variables. So we've been working with strings up to this point. So up here, I could remove my comment. So remember the very first thing we did? We wrote hello world. Hello world is a string. The next line, my name is Professor Gonzalez Altamirano, still a string. And the reason I know it's a string is because it's within quotation marks. Quotation mark right here, quotation mark right here, here, and here. When I did the indentation example, I also created a string, right? Quotation marks. That's how you could recognize strings. And even when I was showing you the variables and values, I was still assigning strings to my variables. But strings are not the only data type that we use in Python. In week 2, we're going to go more in depth on different data types, but for now, I'm just going to show you that, yeah, we use strings in Python and in any other programming language, but at the same time, Python is, because it's a programming language that runs on computers, what are computers really good for? Calculations. I'm sure most of you guys in high school have used calculators like a TI-83 or 4 to do difficult calculations. Programming languages are the same. They can handle complex calculations. You just have to tell it what you want it to do, just like a calculator. So because we can do calculations in Python, what do we need to use? Numbers. And you let's get to an example. So numbers. So we're gonna stick with the idea of variables. So just as I created a variable called message and I gave it a value, I'm gonna create 2 new variables. And I'm gonna create it right. Let's do some separation. That way you can kind of know what's what. So let's do a variable of, and then we'll do 2.3. All right. And then I'm gonna do print, and I'm gonna explain all of this to you in a second. I'm just writing it for now. All right. So, just as you saw up here when I created the variable of message and gave it a value of hello, I did the same thing here. All I did was change the name of my variable. You could name your variable whatever you want. There are certain rules when you create a variable, and you could find those rules in the coding packet. I do believe I have a section on rules. Like, so one of the most important rules is you don't start a variable with a number. You can't do that. So like if I do 2 and then whatever I was going to write, it's going to give me that red line because it's basically saying you can't, it doesn't allow you to do that. It's not something that you can write and be like, oh, well, I didn't mean to do that. No, it's going to remind you that it's not allowed in Python with the red line. So never start your variable with a number, but aside from that, you can basically call it whatever you want. So this underscore that you see, this is just kind of like a snake sort of format that we use in any coding language. The underscore is really just to represent a space, but obviously we can't use a space. That's another rule. You can't use spaces with variables. So because we can't use spaces, but we want to let the user know that, hey, this variable is kind of like two words combined, um, we use the underscore. So this variable, I called it an int. So like it's kind of a weird variable name. You can call it whatever you want. And then the second variable is a float. And what I assign to each variable are numbers. So like I said, we're going to learn about data types next week in week 2. But for now, just know an integer in Python just means a whole number. So the reason I called my variable an int is basically to tell the user or any other programmer who's looking at my program that this variable an int is holding an integer number. It's holding a whole number. And we know that because I assigned it the value of 2, which is a whole number. Now, a float, which is my second variable, float just means like it's another data type in Python. It holds decimal numbers. So like you could do like 2.5, 2.7, 5.5, whatever you want. It can hold decimal numbers, which is great. So for that, I assigned it 2.3. So I have two variables, and both variables have numerical values. And another way of distinguishing a numerical value, regardless of its data type, whether it's an integer or a float, from a string, is that these are not surrounded in quotation marks. So they're not that orange color that these strings are. They have their own color. It's like a light green, and obviously there's no quotation marks. So now, what's the purpose of using numbers? I did tell you that it's to do calculations, but you might be thinking, hey, why store a number inside of a variable? Why not just use the number as is? Like if I have my calculator, I'm not going to write an int plus 2 to get 4. I'll just do 2 plus 2. As you see later on, it does kind of benefit you to store stuff within variables. That way we could reuse those variables multiple times throughout our code instead of writing the number 2 multiple times throughout our code. Because it can get really repetitive and it's just easier to reference that variable, especially when those variables start storing huge pieces of data. So for now, just kind of get used to the idea of what a variable is, what a value is. They're always kind of connected to one another. And then in this final line that I wrote, it's back to our print statement. We're going to use print statements a lot throughout this course, so get used to it. So inside of the previous print statements, I did the quotation marks, right? Because I was trying to print out a string. Now in this print statement, you don't see any quotation marks. It's just you see a variable name, because remember, an int is my variable name up here, and then you see a plus 3. So what's really happening in this print statement? Well, let's run it. Let's see. Oh. Well, you see everything else that all of this, ignore all of that. Just pay attention to that 5. So that 5, now I'm going to close this. Why did it print out 5? Well, what value is associated with an int? 2, right? So if we know an int equals 2, then wouldn't it be fair to say that this print statement is really just reading 2 plus 3? That's exactly what it's doing. So yes, I could just write 2 and just remove the whole need of using this variable, but like I mentioned, when you start dealing with larger sets of data, it does help to store it inside of a variable, because what if this was 1 plus 5? And what happens here? Or obviously I have to include an int here. So what do you think happens here? What's the new value of an int? Well, it has a value, but the value is a calculation itself. So an int is now 1 plus 5, which is 6. But it does that calculation when it executes the code. So when I do this print statement, it's doing 1 plus 5 plus 3. It does the 1 plus 5 first, so it's going to get 6, and then it's going to do plus 3, which is 9. So if I print this out again, you're going to see 9. So hopefully that kind of shows you that storing numerical numbers and variables can be useful in that you could do multiple calculations in different places so that it's not all jumbled up. So I guess that's it for calculations. So let's go into exponents. Exponents is very quick. Let's do another print statement. And let's do 5 times 3. What do you think that prints out? 15, right? It's just simple math. 5 times 3, and it's printing it out to the black screen. Okay. What if I want to get the 5 to the power of something? Typically, like if you had your TI-83 calculator, you do 5 and then the up arrow to the power of whatever number your professor tells you to put it at. But in Python, you don't really, you could put the arrow, but it's not going to work because Python doesn't really like that. The way we represent taking a number to a power of something is using the idea of multiplication, taking that number and multiplying it by a different number or a lot of different times, which is taking the power of something. So like if you do 5 to the power of 2, I believe like when they start teaching to the power of something, don't quote me on this because I was never really great at math. It's like 5 times 5, yeah. And then if you do 5 to the power of 3, it's like 5 times 5 times 5, something like that. So it takes the same concept and tries to bring it to Python. So if I want to do 5 to the power of 3, the way I represent that is not 5 times 3, but it's 5 times 3. So the double multiplication symbol is representing taking something to the power of something. So if we do the calculation now, it's 125. So if I do my calculator, you're not going to see my calculator, but I just kind of want to see this for my own sanity. Okay, yeah. 5 times 5 times 5 is 125. Like I said, I was never great at math. But yeah, that's how you take a number to the power of something. And the reason I'm showing you this is because it's good to know these little shortcuts. Obviously, you can Google this if you end up running into a necessity of needing to take a number to something for like one of your homework assignments. Obviously, you could just Google how to get exponents in Python, and it will probably show up for you. But also knowing this just in the back of your head is also beneficial because it saves you time. You don't ever have to look it up for like, obviously when you become a coder, you can't memorize everything. So you will be looking up certain lines of code, but the easy stuff you should just kind of know, and this is one of those easy things that you just kind of know. So that's it for exponents. Module, so this is another kind of way of calculating stuff. So module. So let's do another print statement. A lot of print statements. Let's do 32 divided by 3. All right. So in Python, the arithmetic operators, addition, subtraction, division, multiplication, the way we know it, the way you guys know it from your typical math courses is the same symbols that are used in Python. So if I want to do addition, I would use the plus symbol. If I want to do subtraction, if I want to do subtraction, I'd use the minus symbol. If I want to do division, I would do the forward slash. If I wanted to do multiplication, as you saw in the previous example, it's a single star. And so what I'm doing here in my print statement, I'm saying, okay, 32 divided by 3. And I'm going to get my calculator out. 32 divided by 3, 10.6 something. Remainder. Okay, well, that's the division of that number, but what if I don't want the division output? I don't want 10.6. I just want the remainder of this division. How would I get that? Well, Python has this operator called the module, which allows you to just get the remainder. It doesn't give you the 10.6 repeated, it gives you just the remainder of this division. And to do so, we use a different symbol. So we use the percent symbol, which is this. Okay. So now if I run this, let's see if I can get my screen. Okay. I get 2. Why do I get 2? So let's go back here. So think of it like this. How many times does 3 go into 32 evenly? Well, 10 times, right? So 30, because that's what 32 divided by 3 is 10.6 repeated. So if I know 3 goes into 32 10 times, that means it's basically like it goes all the way up to 30. And it doesn't go in another time. So if I do, so what's remaining? If the total is 32 and 3 only goes into 32 whole all the way up to 30, that means there's 2 remaining. So that's that answer. The remainder is 2. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, why do I need to know this? Understanding modules will help you later on when we get into conditional, when we get into loops, because it's kind of like a way of making your loop work by telling your loop, hey, only go up to the remainder of something. But we'll get into the use of modules and other arithmetic and operators later on, but just I'm basically introducing you to the concept of these operators. So you got the module, you got the basic addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and you got the exponent, which is the double multiplication sign. Okay, so let us go into... I don't want to make this video too long. I do feel like it's already quite long. It's about 43 minutes at the moment. So let's see. I think the next most important thing, I showed you guys the multi-line comments, and I told you, okay, I'm just going to briefly tell you this. So, like I said, this is a single line comment, because it's only green for one line. And you guys saw as I was going example by example, if I wanted to make other multiple lines green at once, I would do 3 quotation marks here at where I want it to begin, and then the 3 quotation marks where I want it to end. And then everything in between is one whole multi-line comment. Now, what if I did this? So what if I did what if I created a variable and I called it message, and I'm assigning it a string. So we're going to go back to strings here. So I'm going to say this is a multi-line comments. do you notice all these red lines? That's like underneath my comment, and it looks really weird. It's not orange all over. It's like orange. It starts on orange for this line, and then becomes white, and then it's white. This is because even though like our comments, or not our comments, our strings are supposed to be in quotation marks, the moment you try to span it across multiple lines, single quotation marks are no longer sufficient. You do need to do the triple quotation marks, and at that point, it'll say, Python will recognize it and say, oh, he's trying to do one long comment across multiple lines. Okay, I'll accept it. Now, what you're probably thinking is, why is this orange and why was it green before? Well, the difference is, it's only going to be orange. You could only do a multi-line comment for that becomes a real string when you're assigning it to a variable. So that's why it's so important that this multi-line comment come after, it must be attached to a variable. So like I attached it to the variable of message, and that's why when I do the triple quotation mark, it's saying, oh, okay, so he's not doing a comment here, he's doing a string because it belongs to this variable. So that's kind of the difference. If you want a multi-line string, assign it to a variable. If you want a multi-line comment, then you don't need to do the whole variable thing. Just put your quotation marks anywhere you want your comment to begin, and then put it wherever you want it to end, and it will become green. So that's the difference. There sometimes is confusion with that. So let's see what else. Um, plus equals. Plus equals is. I'll show you plus equals. It's fine. So let's go to something like print. No. Let's go. Let's go up here. Remember we had our two variables, these two? And I'm gonna kind of get rid of this too. Not get rid of it, but multi-line comment it. Let's do print. I don't think it likes it. Hold on. It's catching this. Okay. Then let's get rid of this. Okay. Alright. So, sorry about that. So we're just going to focus on these two lines. We have our two variables. We have the an int and we have a float, and they both hold numbers. So what I was going to show you was the plus equals. So let's do an int plus equals 2. So what this is really, plus equals isn't something that's necessary to learn in Python, but it's shorthand, because when you start writing a lot of code, um, you start writing a lot of code, and what's going to happen is when you start writing hundreds of lines of code, you really start developing pain in your hands and in your wrists. So any way of shortening your code is ideal, and this is what plus equals allows us to do. So this line of code of an int plus 2 is really just taking the value of an int and adding 2 to it. So if I were to write this out in its full form, it would be this. It would be an int equals an int plus 2. And what I'm doing here is, just like in the previous examples, I'm changing the value of an int, but I'm not replacing it with a different number. I'm just saying use the current value of an int and add 2 to it, which is why I say an int equals an int plus 2. Because you can't just do an int equals 2, because at that point you're doing a whole different thing. You're just assigning a value of 2 instead of what it was 6. So instead of writing all of this, and int equals and int plus 2, programmers will just typically write and int plus equals 2. These two lines mean the exact same thing. This is just the shorthand of doing that. So if you see plus equals, that's really what they're doing. So don't freak out when you see that. It's nothing crazy. So that's plus equals. Let's see what else. Okay. Joining strings. They use this word. I can't say this word. It's too big brain for me. This is the word that they use, and it's to reference joining two different strings. So let's go all the way back up to this example. Okay, so remember we had these two strings that I created at the very beginning of this video. Hello world, and my name is Professor Gonzalez, right? So let's get rid of this. Now, what if I didn't print these out? What if I changed the way I wrote this? What if I did intro equals hello world, and then I did greeting equals my name is Professor Gonzalez. So what I did here was, instead of just doing a plain print statement, which is just printing text to the black screen, I'm assigning that string of hello world and my name is Professor Gonzalez to a variable of my creation. So I created two new variables here, intro and greeting, and I assigned these strings to those variables. So why did I do that? Why not just do the whole print statement? Well, because I'm going to join them together. So this is another purpose of using variables, because it gives you more flexibility in what you could do with your code rather than just the basic print statements. So let's see how I join this together. Give me a second. So the way you would typically do it, there's a couple ways of doing it. So I could do like I could do this, and then I could do this. So let me just get rid of this. Okay. So now if I print this out, oh, let me run that again. I lost my screen. Okay. So instead of being two separate lines as it was before, now it's one line. Even though I wrote them on separate lines and essentially assigned them to variables, they became one line when I printed them out, and that's because I joined them together. And that's what this word means, to join two strings together. And the way you do that is with the plus operator. So plus isn't just used for addition in Python. It can also be used to join strings together. And you might be thinking, why did I create this third variable? Well, it's just my way, and it's like an organized way of writing code. So like if I'm going to join these two variables, you could, this is not wrong, you could do intro plus greeting. That's perfectly fine. That's the same thing that I did up here. And that would join two strings. But because I don't want this print statement to be all cluttered, and I just wanted to print out this one word, basically that's the point of the creating that third variable, just so that your code is nice and clean. So when other people are reading it, they say, "Oh, he's just printing out a variable," and then all they have to do is look in previous lines of your code and search for that variable to see what are they trying to print out, instead of seeing intro plus greeting plus conclusion plus something else. It could be very long. Um, it could get very cluttered. So it's better to kind of like, if you're going to join strings, create a third variable and place that joining action in that variable. And then when you print out just the name of that variable, like I did here, a full greeting. So that's that. There's one last thing that I want to cover for this video, and then I promise I'm done. um, Another long video, but there's a lot to cover. And you guys, I don't really know your expertise in Python, so that's why I'm kind of introducing it in the most basic way, at least the way I was taught. Um, and obviously, if you guys have questions, reach out to me via email. If you guys want me to explain something a little bit more in depth, um, definitely reach out. I could do one-on-one WebEx. I can do um, I could answer questions on the, what was it called again, Slack, or via email. It's really up to you. Uh, don't be afraid to reach out. I guess that's my main point. If you don't understand something, I'm trying to explain it, but it's a little bit difficult when we're not in class and I can't see your faces, because usually when I'm in class, I'm explaining a subject, and then like I start rambling, as you guys can tell. I like to ramble, and then I look to the class, and then I see my students, and I just see this glossed look on their face, and it's just like, oh, okay. Everything I'm saying is just going over their head, and then at that point I could say, okay, guys, what do you not understand? And I immediately get that feedback. And here, since we're fully online, it's a little bit difficult. So that's what I'm saying. If you don't understand something, reach out to me. But I'm trying to talk and generate questions on my own. So one last topic for today, and I promise we're done. So you guys saw print statements. You guys saw um, print statements, variables, numbers, indentation, calculations, exponents, module, joining strings, plus equals, multi-line strings and comments. Now the last thing I'm going to show you guys is actually, how do you make your code interactive? So obviously the programmer is going to write their code, just as we wrote our code thus far, and that's all coming from the programmer. But what if the programmer, like myself, like the teacher who needs feedback from their students, the programmer also needs feedback from the user, whoever's using the program. So just like when you guys go to, let's say, the Instagram app, and you guys are interacting with the application. That application is an application. It has code in the background. So whenever you guys are interacting, whenever you're posting pictures or liking a post, you're interacting with that interface. You're the user in that case, and the Instagram programmers are the programmers. So there's an interaction going on there. So how do we get that interaction with our programs? Well, the most simplest way of doing so is by taking in user input. So let's write a section for user input. And I believe the textbook does cover this as well, which is why I wanted to cover it. You're not going to see it in the coding packet, but you will see it in the textbook and obviously here as well. So let's see, user input. I do have a section on this. I wrote quite a bit of code, so I am going to copy and paste this because I don't feel like writing all of this, because it's a lot. Okay. All right. So we're going to tackle this step by step. Okay. So user input, Python input with strings. So you guys know what strings are, right? So strings are anything inside of the quotation marks. If we want to get user input, there's a specific keyword that we need to mention in our code. And that keyword is obviously input, because that's the newest keyword that I'm introducing to you guys. Now, what is this word on the left-hand side? You guys could kind of know by the color of the word. Um, if the color of the word is white, at least in Visual Studio, and other IDEs it might be a different color scheme, and even in Visual Studio, like I mentioned, you guys could change the colors of certain words. But in this case, by default, a word that is the color white is our variable. So the variable here is name, and I'm assigning a value to name, but the value that I'm assigning to name is input. But you just told me input is a keyword that takes in user input. So what is really the value? Well, let's see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment out all this so it doesn't interfere, and I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, so now the only thing that Python is going to read is name equals input. So I don't, yeah. I was going to say it should only take in, so let's do Professor Gonzalez Altamirano. Yeah, that should be pretty much it. So the reason I stopped there, I hesitated for a second because I was saying the line of code that I created is just asking the user to write something, and that's it. It's not doing anything with whatever I'm writing, it just takes it. And that's what you saw. I typed in, it just gave me a blinking line. It didn't give me any indication on what to do, what to type, it just gave me a blinking line. So at the most basic form, that's what input is. Um, it just it takes in user input. It doesn't tell the user to do anything, it just takes it in. And by default, it doesn't really do anything with it. It just stores it in the variable called name. So now, let's move on to the second line. All right, so what do I have here? Name equals input, but inside of input, I wrote something. I wrote a string, because you guys know strings are within quotation marks and they're the color orange. Okay, well, what's going to print out when I run this code? Well, we're going to see. Okay, so it says, what is your name? So now I have the ability to write something. Okay, so what is the difference between this example and the previous example? Well, this example, it at least gave me direction, or at least gave me a question on what it's expecting me to write. And the previous example didn't give me anything. But in this case, the string of what is your name showed up to me, the user, it prompted me and said, what's your name? And I responded with my name. So yeah, okay. So now you guys know if you want to take in user input, you use the keyword input, parentheses, and then if you want, that's it. But if you want to give the user guidance on what to write, write a string. It doesn't have to be what is your name. It could be, please enter your DOB. Please enter your date of birth. Okay, so at least I know what to write. So typically you would include a string to kind of give your user guidance. It's the polite thing to do, especially when you start writing programs that are specific in what they take in, which is what I'm going to get to next. So we don't have to get to this because I basically just explained it. So we don't have to worry about that. So let's start with Python input with numbers. Okay, so just as we can take in input from the user in word form, and so like when I wrote my name, which is Professor Gonzalez Altamirano, um, and it saved that to the variable of name, it saved it as a string. But what if I want the user to input numbers and save it as a integer or a float? And obviously we're going to get to that next week. But what if I want to save it as a number, not a string? because I want to use that number later on, and I need that number to be an actual number, because there is a difference between, so I'm going to actually show you here. So if I wanted to, yeah, so let's get rid of this. Okay, so let's also comment out this. Okay, so these are the two lines that are going to actually execute. So the first line, as you saw, it has a variable num, and the value of num is input. So you guys know what input does. It tells it doesn't ask the user. It allows the user to enter data into the program. What is this next line that's printing out? It's printing type num. So what is type? We haven't seen that before. This is the first time you guys are seeing it. So type is basically, it's another kind of special, do they call it special method? Special function? It's like a built-in function in Python that allows you to check to see the data type of a value, so, or a variable. A value stored in a variable. So when I'm saying type num, what Python's really doing is Python is checking the value of num. What is it? Is it a string? Is it a number? Is it an integer? Is it a float? And it returns whatever type that is to the black screen, which is the print, because print sends whatever's inside of it to the black screen. So let's see. Let's run the code. Let's give it a second. Oh, I have to type something out. 5. Okay. So underneath 5, I clicked 5 and I pressed enter, right? So what is this line that appeared? Because we've never seen that before. It says class, and then it says str. So Python is a object-oriented programming language, so everything in Python is essentially an object, and objects are like stored inside of like classes, and we're gonna get to that later on. Don't worry about that. For now, whoops. For now, just know that str right here is saying that whatever the value, that 5 that I just entered in, is being saved as a string. So it's not being saved as a number, it's being saved as a string, which is not necessarily what I want. So how do I get 5 to be saved as a number? That's the real question here. So it's not the way we've been doing it, because the way we've been doing it is to save it as a string. So if we move on to this next line of code, so x equals, I'm going to erase this. So now we have a new variable. We have the variable x, and inside of x, I'm doing equals, which is the assignment operator, equals int, parenthesis, input, enter an integer. So what's really happening here? Don't worry about everything underneath here. We'll get to it. Maybe, maybe not. So x equals int. So let's start off with this. Let's start off with the most inner parenthesis. What is this? It's a string, right? Why? Because it's in quotation marks. Okay. Well, if we know this is a string, nothing to be scared there. What is this? Input. Input, we just learned it. Input is to allow the user to input data into our program. Okay, makes sense. So we've seen all of this together, right? Input, and then inside of it, giving the user guidance on what to rewrite into the program. We've seen that in previous examples. So don't be scared when you see that. The only thing that's changed here is this integer, this int keyword, that is prefixing input. So in this case, what is this really doing? Well, in Python, when we do int and then parenthesis, and then we put, say, input inside of it, what that is really telling Python is it's saying, okay, well, for whatever this input that this user is going to write into the program, only allow the user to create integer values. So you're going to see an example of it working and an example of it not working. So first, let's run the code. So it's saying enter an integer. So let's do it correctly. So I'm gonna just do 5. Okay, it says you have entered 5, which is great. Let me do, what was it? Print. I believe it was type, and then let's do x. Right? I have to stop the program. Okay. So I just want to confirm that the number that I typed in is an actual integer number. Okay. Yep. So I entered in the number 5. There was another print statement that just says you have entered 5, which is fine. That third line where it says class int. Now, when it says class int, that means that number 5 that I initially wrote is being saved as an integer number. It's not being saved as str. It's not a string anymore. It's an integer number, which is really important, and it will be important as we move forward. Distinguishing how we're saving our data. Even though it looks like a number, it might not be saved as a number. And the only way we know if it's an actual number or a string is by, let me get back to the main screen, is by using this line right here. If you want to check to see the data type of a certain value or a certain variable, a value stored inside of a variable, do print type, and don't forget all these parentheses. These parentheses are very important. This first set of parentheses is for print. This second set of parentheses, it belongs to type. And this x inside of it is the variable x, which is storing user data. And that user data comes from me. When I typed in 5, I was acting as the user. So, yeah, if you ever want to know the data type of whatever value you're working with that exists inside of a variable, just use type. Um, so yeah, so that's, oh, an example of it not working, let's get to that. So what if I were to write Professor Gonzalez? Does it give me the error? Okay. Um, it doesn't like it. And it didn't allow me to show you. Let me see if I can run it again. So I'm going to try to minimize the screen. Give me a second. Okay. So do you see... Oh, I need to write it. Okay. Do you see this? Okay, you see this. So right here, an X showed up. The command prompt where I typed in Professor Gonzalez, it's still there. It's not, the moment I close it, this will go away. So that's why I'm leaving it open, but I'm staying on this screen. So right here, it highlighted this line of code, and it's saying exception thrown. Invalid literal for int. So what that is saying is that it's only going to accept whole numbers. It's not going to accept strings. And the fact that I tried to give it a string, it just doesn't fly with Python. Because the moment I included this int right here, it limited the user, which in this case was me, to a certain data type pool. So it only allows me to put in numbers, it doesn't allow me to put in strings. And that can be good, so like when you write your code, you want to limit what the user could enter in. Because like say, I'm sure you guys, I don't know if some of you guys are cybersecurity, um, say you're working with a database and you're trying to prevent the user from entering in SQL code, like a SQL injection, into your SQL database. Say in the query section of your database, they're entering in all the SQL and injection code, but if you were to limit your queries to just maybe like, let's say like numbers, or I don't know if this specific thing will work, but say pretend it does. If you limit them to just numbers, then they can't enter in SQL injection code that might be like x equals true or something like that. Because it will only accept numbers. It won't accept actual words. So it could be useful in that scenario. So like limiting the user to only reply or like only enter in data that you want that you want them to enter in, like expected data, is very useful. So that this is just like one of those things that's always good to know. Some people are too lazy and they don't include it. Don't be that person. Include integer. Um, and then here, this other example, like when I said I wasn't sure if we're going to get to it, it's the same thing. The only difference is instead of accepting integer numbers, it's accepting float numbers. Float numbers, as you guys heard before, is just instead of being whole numbers as integer, these are decimal numbers. So it accepts all decimal numbers. Yeah, and then don't worry about this. Okay, this video is 1 hour and 16 minutes, very long. But I suggest that if you guys made it this far, great. Hopefully this was helpful. I tried to expand on the textbook and even on my coding packet. I don't want to just read off the coding packet because you guys can obviously read the packet yourselves. I want to kind of show you examples. I kind of want to give you the way I understand it. I feel like it could be helpful, and that's why I'm creating these videos, giving you my perspective in voice form. To kind of supplement that maybe 1 hour, 2 hour class that you would typically have for an in-person course. So if you guys like this, great. I hope it's useful. I'm going to continue doing it for the remaining 6 weeks. So this is week 1, video 1. This is just an introduction. So hopefully you guys feel comfortable with all the subjects that were included in this introduction video. We're going to build off it. So next week we're going to get into data types and we're going to do step by step. There's never going to be this huge jump. I'm always going to try to explain it in simple terms, just as I did in this video. And like I said, if you guys have questions, want me to expand on a certain topic a little bit more, or explain it a little bit more clearly, with more examples, happy to do that. Just reach out via email, reach out via Slack, reach out via not just those two. um, and I'll get back to you. So yeah, that's it for this week. I'll see you guys in week 2.